Recording and okay. Yeah, you're on.
Okay. Perfect. Hello, everyone. I am Karen Cope, and I am a researcher and collaborator with the Counter Memory Activism Research Group. I'm based at MassGad. I would like to begin by acknowledging that we are in Kutchbuktuk, Mi'kma'ki, the current and historically unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. This territory is covered by the treaties of peace and friendship, which Mi'kmaq, Wolastoqiyik, and Passamaquoddy peoples first signed with the British Crown in 1726. I would also like to extend gratitude to the ancestors of this land, as well as to the lands wherever you are. Counter Memory Activism is an interdisciplinary research creation project between artists, museologists, curators, and scholars of genocide and memory studies, exploring the current questions and historical context of memory activism, as well as broader themes such as collective memory and the commemoration of heritage and difficult histories. This research project has been funded by the Social Science and Humanities Research Council of Canada, also known as SSHRC's, Insight Development Grant. This project is a partnership between the Nova Scotia College of Art and Design and the University of King's College in Kutchbuktuk, Halifax, Nova Scotia, Canada. Tonight's event will consist of a speaking portion and a question period. Questions can be asked by viewers through the chat feature, but they will only be visible to me, the moderator, who will then pose the selected questions to the speaker. Before I introduce Nicholas, I would like to remind you that upcoming speakers are Wambui Kamiru, who will be talking to us on April 7th at 5 p.m. AST, Atlantic Standard Time. Actually, it should be ADT, right? Atlantic Daytime. Sylvia Hamilton on April 14th at 7, and Veronica Tello on May 5th. You can find out more about all of that by checking out the countermemoryactivism.ca website or Facebook and Instagram at Counter Memory Activism. Tonight's speaker is Nicholas Galanin, and I am delighted to introduce Nicholas. Nicholas Galanin is a Tlingit and Unangax multidisciplinary artist and musician. Born in Sitka, Alaska in 1979, he has worked creatively across media since his youth, when he apprenticed with master carvers and jewelers in his community. Galanin holds a BFA from London Guildhall University in jewelry design and an MFA in Indigenous Visual Arts from Massey University in New Zealand. He is also a founder and frontman of Yatsin, a Sitka band that recently signed with the Sub Pop label. Their debut album, Indian Yard, will be released at the end of April, although I encourage you to take a few sneak hit listens from his website. Although tonight is my first encounter face-to-face, if that's what we call this, with Nicholas, I have been a super fan of his work since my partner and I sailed into Juneau, Alaska during the summer of 2013, and we encountered a solo show of Nicholas's work there. I was entranced and challenged to think in new ways about Indigenous relations to land, history, and futurity by the mix of video, dance, music, critique, bookworks, cut-ups, and sculpture that Galanin presented there. I went back again and again to see the show and came back to Nova Scotia raving about this amazing young Tlingit and Unangax artist on the far west coast of Southeast Alaska. Over the past 2 decades, Nicholas Galanin's work has ranged across media, materials, and processes. He has splintered tourist industry replica carvings into pieces and offered the rearranged fragments, refracted into photos, objects, and video as evidence of the damage of commodification to culture. His practice includes customary cultural objects, but with a shift, thus petroglyphs in sidewalks and coastal rock, masks cut from anthropological texts, and a taxidermied polar bear melting into a pool of its own fur. In 2020, for the Sydney Biennale, Galanin excavated the shape of the shadow of the Captain James Cook statue in Hyde Park, a gesture that not only examines the effects of colonization on land and critiques anthropological bias, but also ultimately suggests the burial of that statue and others like it. More recently still, in 2021, we're getting close here, he created a replica of the Hollywood sign for the Desert 10 Biennial in Palm Springs, California, which reads Indian land, thus directly advocating for and supporting the land back and real rent initiatives. Galanin is represented by Peter Blum Gallery in New York and lives and works with his family in Tlingit, Sitka, Alaska. I am thrilled that he is with us tonight or this afternoon, depending on where you are in the world. And I'm very eager to hear from him about his practice. I am grateful to NASCAD University, to King's University College, and to the Counter Memory Research Project, and all of those people, colleagues and students who have helped to make tonight's talk possible. Welcome to these unceded lands of Mi'kmaq, Nicholas. We are thrilled that you're here. Over to you.
Ms. Cheech, thank you. I'm going to try to share my screen here real quick. I want to thank everybody for joining me today. Yehitsin Yuhat Dusak, Lukna Hari Hatsati, Kagwantan Yadi Ayachat, Shikakwan. My name is Yehitsin Nicholas Galanin. I am Lukna Hari, a child of the Kagwantan people of Sitka. I am home in Sitka right now, and I wanted to just share a few images with you all of home, and just talk a little bit about how land shapes us, how it's provided the abundance and sustenance for our cultures and our communities since time immemorial. So these are some images of some of the seasons here. We live a life of harvesting and hunting and fishing with the seasons. So this is a readout where we dip net the coho salmon, sockeye salmon as well. This is sockeye run primarily, but coho do come through here. And of course, we find ourselves fishing with the bears, who oftentimes are much more successful than us in the fishing. The seasons and the abundance are and if we time it right within a period of a week or certain amount of time in the salmon run, we can harvest enough to feed our families for the year essentially. Processing food is a family effort. This is smoking salmon. And it's something that we often involve, all of our children in as well. So it's a special time of the year. The summer's here. Hunting as well. I teach my children how to process and respect how we live here amongst the land. I'll speak a little bit about continuum and my particular lineage of artists in my family. In the center here is my great-grandfather, George Benson. This is a model canoe for a dugout canoe that was carved here in the community in the 50s or 60s, I believe, and was one of the first canoes to be carved in that era, you know, in this process. So my father, Dave Galanin, Kinda, he's my mentor as well. He's a musician who goes by Strum Dog, or Strum and Dog, and jeweler, sculptor. You know, I had my uncle, Will Burkhart, also a mentor still of mine, wood carver, jeweler, and then my children, who get to, you know, are surrounded by the studio and the space and the process. And you know, this is essentially a part of why or what I do with my cultural work is, you know, to hold it and share it and pass it through to these future generations. So. This is my studio space. Further along, this recent 10-foot totem, you can see from these images, it's since been, of course, completed. Let me see if I can put this screen on full screen. Sorry, just realized that this photos are, there we go. Of course, my totem pole dog, Elvira. And the completed pole. This one, of course, didn't have any paint. It was for a private commission. On its way to Hong Kong right now, actually. So I don't know if we'll ever see this one in person again, unless I get over there. My cousin and apprentice, Lee Burkhart, who's Will, I showed you a photo of my uncle earlier. It's his son. So he's been working with me on a lot of these projects for a few years now, which is great. You know, he grew up doing the art, but really dove in 3 or 4 years ago on, you know, the start of this totem project. This is a 40-foot totem pole carved in Juneau, the community north of us, on Douglas Island. The totem's a healing pole. This is kind of the very first large scale or monumental carving that I'd worked on as the lead carver. So it was, you know, definitely something I feel like I've been preparing for, you know, since I've begun this art form, and something I hope to continue working on and doing in this scale. But with this piece, I was working with the Takuquan and elders in Juneau, the Unangax Wolf clan community in the 60s on this site. Tlingit village was intentionally burnt down to remove the community to make way for the boat harbor that you see in the background there. I mean, you can kind of see it past those cars. And that displacement echoes larger experience within a lot of our indigenous communities. This was recent though. This was, you know, there was a, you know, generation that was there experiencing this that is still here today. So to have this pole go up was really important to the community. I think of it in terms the healing process of this, a pole like this is not only visibility and you know, telling the story and history of the place and representing the community, but also in the process. So in this case, the process of this project, you know, worked with elders in the community and followed protocol to represent the story and community and in a way that honors them, but also for me, the healing was the transfer of knowledge through process. So I had 7 apprentices throughout this project. It was 8, maybe 6 to 7 month project. And, they worked closely with me in completing this. And that exchange of knowledge and experiences really, the life of our community and the life of our culture that gets to, continue through the work that they will do. So, a special project. This is what I'm working on right now. Again, for the same community in Juneau, Gold Belt Heritage. This is a 23-foot dugout canoe that I'm carving with, again, my cousin Lee, who's an apprentice on this, and then my uncle Will Burkhart is also working with us on this, which is great to have because he's very experienced in this process of creating dugout canoes. This is the second dugout canoe that I've worked on. Think of this is red cedar, so same type of log and tree as the totem that I've shown you, and we're carving it at the local university here in Sitka, at the University of Alaska Southeast. Lee is, as I said, the apprentice, and there's another log in Juneau. So once we complete this, he will go over to Juneau and carve that canoe and lead, and train some new apprentices as well. So again, continue on the transfer of knowledge at work. This canoe will be used by the community. It'll be used for harvesting. It'll be used culturally. It'll be used for educational use, ceremonial use. It's sitting upside down right now, so once we finish shaping it, we will flip it, hollow it out, and then steam the canoe, which will widen the gunnels, the beam of it. If you look at the bottom of the hole right now, you can't really see it in this image too well, but there's a slight concave in it that you carve into it. When we turn it over, hollow it out, and steam it, that concave drops down a little bit and gives allows for the gunnels of the canoe to spread open, the bow and the stern pick up a little bit. So there's this transformation that happens, and you have to anticipate that through this process. They look like simple forms, but I think it's probably one of the more complex aspects of wood carving in our culture. And it's utilitarian, so it has to keep community safe. They're going to be out paddling and using this in, our coastlines here, our ocean ways. So, a little bit of backstory from some of my practice that I still continue to do is, I was trained in wood carving customarily and extended that into silversmithing and jewelry design. I went to London, England, and did a bachelor's degree in jewelry design and silversmithing. I still do this work. I think it's very similar to wood carving, to be honest. It's just a smaller scale. Of course, different tools and material, but oops. And some of the other pieces that I've been working on. These are some recent silver fingernails. I know you mentioned I've got a music project out right now. This is the record with my band. You had seen that we've been working on for 3 years. I'm really thrilled to share this through, somebody's legendary as Sub Hop, who's brought the world, Nirvana, and a lot of other artists that were, you know, a big part of my youth anyways. So this is the project that's releases in a month, actually, I think the 31st, so yeah, end of April. Some of the work that I've been working on recently, I think I want to share with you first, because I don't know how much time we actually have here. I didn't check, but I want to make sure that there's enough time for questions too. Does somebody have that?
Oh yeah, you can go for as long as you want. I would say another 20 minutes or so if you want, and
okay.
You know, whatever
Yeah,
works.
I'm gonna just kind of run through these because I don't want to go too long.
Sure.
But this is a photo of Rick Williams, the brother of John T. Williams. This photograph was taken in Seattle in 2020, early 2020, around the time that these Black Lives Matters and anti-police brutality protests were, you know, sweeping the globe, I would say, really. And I wanted to share this photo particularly because Rick Williams, his brother John T. Williams, was murdered extrajudicially by Officer Ian Burke of the Seattle Police Department, August 30th, 2010. And you know, a decade later, these conversations are still being held in our communities. John T. Williams was a wood carver that was hard of hearing and was crossing the street in the afternoon or morning with his totem pole and his wood carving knife when Officer Ian Burke shot him 4 times in the back. This piece was created after that for John T. Williams. Statistically, Native Americans are the highest risk of being killed by police officers. Precedent for this behavior has been well established through the history of the United States, in which military, cavalry, and settlers legally protected and often rewarded for murdering Indigenous men, women, and children. This is a hand drum, skinned with an American flag, and the drumstick is carved out of red cedar, material that would be used by carvers like John T. Williams. Of course, this drumstick's carved into the form of that baton, Billy Cook. God complex. This is 6 feet, so this is, you know, life size. Ceramic riot gear reflects the fragility and the fear of the police state. The position references the attempt at making martyrs out of those who damage our communities and murder Black and brown youth by politicians and media. The title refers to the pathological belief that the police exist above the rest of us with authority to determine who lives and how. This is legacy to historic colonial violence on Indigenous land. Around the time of these social, you know, the social protests and demonstrations happening, which some would say are the largest since civil rights in the 60s. I actually feel like these are just extensions of that. You know, it's continuation of these conversations that are still unfortunately necessary and are still ongoing in our communities. There was other conversations surrounding and sweeping the globe at the time. And these were, you know, conversations of monument and around about whose monuments and what these monuments in our communities represent and who they are representing, oftentimes as from an Indigenous perspective. These monuments are of, you know, those that actively removed us through murder, through genocide, to create space for settler communities. And those monuments are still upheld in, a lot of these places. So I was asked to participate in the Biennale of Sydney near in 2020 by curator Brooke Andrew. And about a year before the Biennale, he brought me out, and I, do these community visits, which are oftentimes necessary if you're going to be working in site-specific places, just to meet the communities, and see, get a little more insight into these spaces. So, I spent some time in Sydney. I went up to the Tiwi Islands, which was an incredible experience. I visited the actual first site of European landing on what is now called Australia, which was actually in a Tiwi Island location. It wasn't Captain James Cook, which is the narrative that's often upheld. And there was, a similar narrative that had been upheld and told that is highly problematic and actively erases Indigenous histories, memorialized by monument or statue. And that's the Captain Cook statue in Hyde Park, which has a discovery plaque on it. And that narrative of discovery is harmful to our community, Indigenous communities. It removes and participates in that erasure of, in this case, some of the oldest known civilizations on the planet, insinuating that this discovery was the start or the basis of a birth of a community that had been in existence. I was aware that there would be a 250th anniversary coming up for this, and I guess I couldn't have planned or known that this conversation would actually sweep the globe in another context, which is we've seen these statues become central in these larger conversations with the Black Lives Matter movement and within other communities of racist representations of Indigenous Black and brown bodies in statue form, or of even Confederate statues that have been, maintained across the U.S. During this time, there's a statue of, I think, Roosevelt in front of the American Natural History Museum in New York that had become a point of contention for its, problematic portrayal. I don't know if I got that right. There we go. This is the Cook statue at Hyde Park in Sydney, and oftentimes, when these communities would gather and protest of these, the first thing the government would do would be to try to protect these statues with barriers. So I included those barriers in this conversation. The work is titled "Shadow on the Land: An Excavation and Bush Burial." A lot of times, conversations surrounding monuments, some of the most, I think, pitiful arguments towards them is, if you take these down, you'll lose our history, which is completely false. And this work is a perfect example of that, I think, in the sense that the actual statue is not here at all. And I feel like this has provided enough context and space to have critical conversations surrounding this history with no actual statue present. The concept of the work It's an excavation, anthropological dig site. So to dig down deep enough to bury the statue. And in the process of that dig, of course, uncovering a few things in the soil. One is contradicting the discovery plaque by, the idea that you will find lots of evidence of indigenous existence in the ground, in the soil, the history of that. And then the other aspect of that is some of the toxicity of the soil from colonial resource extraction and misuse and abuse of land. So in this particular installation, obviously, it's a work site, so we're not going to hit the depth of that actual statue, but that's the intention of the work. And we're only allowed to dig so deep due to the fact that the soil below is highly toxic. And a lot of colonial and settler expansion in our communities is due to resource extraction and mining, all these other issues that affect our communities directly. Globally, this is something that happens here in Alaska, and we've been finding conversations with outside mining companies that want to come and mine, which is often, impacts our small villages and communities immediately. And these are communities that often rely on, we all rely on clean resources and clean water, but some of the harvesting and subsistence lifestyles are deeply impacted by these immediately. One aspect of the Title II, shadow on the land, references that shadow, that colonial shadow. This is a literal excavation of the shadow that the statue casts upon the land. And bush burial is a reference to a Frederick McCubbin painting that's in one of the National Galleries and Museums in Australia, titled "A Bush Burial." It was created in 1890. It's a fabricated, romanticized image of a settler body embedded into Aboriginal land. It's literally a painting of the first white settler buried that had died on what is now, referred to as Australia. And it was this romanticization of that becoming or being part of these indigenous lands. So this work references that. This is the most recent piece that I just unveiled for Desert X21 in Palm Springs, Agua Caliente, Coahuila land. And the title of the work is Never Forget. It's a 2-scale, it's based on the Hollywood land sign, which was first created as a white-only real estate advertisement, which went on to become, they took off the word land in Hollywood, and it went on to become just Hollywood, which is now, become this iconic symbol of an industry, and of this industry is also responsible for, misrepresenting indigenous communities historically throughout almost all of cinema and these narratives. This work is, the letters are 45 feet high, so it's, it's massive. And the actual piece is not this image here, it's not the sign. The actual work is the call to action that this piece is intended to create, which is, we recognize that, as you notice, institutions will participate in land acknowledgements almost more and more as we go, which is something that hadn't been common practice as far as even 10 years ago, I think. But it's recognizing that these acknowledgements without action are empty. And this work is an invitation for everybody in these communities to participate in action beyond land acknowledgement. And in this case, the action it references land back movement. It's a movement that understands that Indigenous communities have deep, long-standing relationships with place and land and caring for land, and it is a movement that wants places that care back into our Indigenous communities. That care is vital to everybody that's here, that we share this space with. That care for these places is something that I've also referenced in this work, is that 3% of legal land title in the United States now is held by Indigenous communities. There are more and more versions of returning land back to our communities, and there's different histories depending on where you go, even state to state, on how these communities have land or do not have access to land. In Alaska, we have the Alaska Native Land Claims Act, which was something that was put into place in the 70s, I believe. And our land here is now managed by Native corporations. The call for land back with this work also allows for, in this case, I set up a GoFundMe to hopefully raise enough funds to transfer legal title of some sacred sites here in the community back to the Indigenous community through Native American Land Conservancy, which is an organization that I'm working with. So we've picked out a few sites, and for me, that is the actual piece. That's the actual work we're talking about. And this is just a form of engagement and engaging and hopefully captivating audiences and communities that otherwise have not educated themselves in these conversations or histories. A lot of this history is not often even told or taught in our children's curriculum. So let's see where I'm at. Oh, how are we doing on time?
You're doing great. This is amazing.
Okay.
Please take as much time as you'd like. Thank you.
This work is it's called here again. Sorry, my notes are a little out of order. Oh, Architecture of Return Escape Metropolitan Museum of Art. Deer hide, pigment, acrylic. This is the first series of hide paintings for guiding the escape of Indigenous remains and objects and non-Indigenous institutions to return to their home communities. Architecture of Return Escape Metropolitan Museum of Art is a mapped escape plan for objects held in the Met and in New York City. The work is a plan for wayfinding during decolonization, requiring return, building new structures for good ways of being. A few objects held in display cases and many more, including human remains and ceremonial objects not intended for public view, are held in museum archives. The cost and process required to travel and visit these archives limits access to cultural knowledge and inheritance for Indigenous communities, and continues the removal of the objects from their land and people, while institutions control the air, temperature, humidity, UV exposure, and dust. and unable to adequately care for these objects in cultural or spiritual ways. Painting information on hides to remember and instruct has a long history in many Indigenous communities, particularly for recording significant events or feats of bravery. In this series of work, the hide paintings depict a floor plan referencing a visitor's guide and an architecture blueprint for the building. The objects themselves are unwilling visitors to the museum, and the painting builds a route for escape and vision for reunification of cultural inheritance with community. In painting the galleries of the museum containing Indigenous American objects, along with elevators and stairs coming from the archives, marked with red dashed lines leading to the exit. The exit from the museum is also an entrance for our cultural atu, or ceremonial objects imprisoned in these spaces. An entrance for return to land, community, and culture. The work serves as a reminder of the past and is a plan for a good way forward, where stolen objects, human remains, and work sold under duress can return home for their own health, for the health of the communities that created them, and for the health of the communities that took them. Atu, inside a closed container. Atu inside a closed container is a weathered bentwood box with formline design attached to the box face. Carved wooden safe handles and carved wooden combination dial on this, varying the number 1 and fractions counting down to 0 instead of numbers counting up to 10. Inside the box is an unaltered sea otter hide with pattern outlines drawn on the skin side. The weathered box represents the container for our culture, knowledge, and customs that have been weathered over time as we carried it forward. Transformed into a kind of safe, the work insists on the value of cultural knowledge and practice. Sculpture bears the impulse to protect what is valuable and threatened through colonial understandings of wealth as something restricted to a few. The combination lock and safe handle are clearly new additions to unweathered wood and represent the requirement of blood quantum as a barrier to access. The fractions on the combination dial point to the barring of our descendants from accessing ancestral knowledge, cultural practices, and rites based on fraction of certified Indian blood. The sea otter hide contained within the box has not been significantly altered in accordance to the United States Fish and Wildlife legislation. And so under US law, the work cannot be owned by an individual not determined legal via Alaska Native blood quantum. The otter hide bearing pen outlines of uncut children's mittens patterns demonstrates the unfinished labor and blockage of cultural continuum forced onto Indigenous culture by federally legislated blood quantum. And the arbitrary nature of who and what is considered whole. Legislation around the sale of otter fur like blood quantum revolves around perceived wholeness. A hide that cannot be made whole again is considered acceptable for non-Alaska Native sale. And the person not considered a large enough fraction of whole Alaska Native cannot continue this cultural practice. There's laws federally based on percentage of blood quantum of who's allowed to hunt seal or sea otter or work with these materials. I have peers in the community that are artists that work with these materials that cannot teach their children. Their children can't help them hunt. Their children can't handle the material based on them not qualifying for these federal laws. Blood quantum, which is essentially a form of genocide within our communities and removing us from our culture. So what else I got here? What do we become? Personal contemporary experiences and continuation of an attempt to remove cultural practice by institution, homogenize knowledge, and disconnect for romanticize iconography in the form and medium. This series was cut and bound text, anthropological text, oftentimes. So this text here is from Undermount St. Elias, Smithsonian anthropological text, published in the 70s, that is full of pre-contact and just around the contact period of our culture in anthropology form. A lot of the anthropological text from that era is written from outside perspective and placed on our community, into our communities, and it's also a lot of that text is something that contributes to perceived authenticity of culture or belonging. It freezes oftentimes people's ideas of who we are, who we should be, to a specific era or period in the past. And that's something that almost every Indigenous artist I know has had to come to terms or face in conversation. See if we can play this. Who we are, anthropological catalogs of removal, foundations to institution, dispossession lays groundwork for appropriation, collection as a means of control and genocide. We belong to these objects and have memory collectively stored in them. This video loop is a 15-minute loop of over, I believe, 60,000 still frame images of objects, anthropologically categorized, and these are objects that are all in institution and museum collections around the world. I'm just gonna keep moving because that just goes on for some time. Indians' children's bracelets. Tourists and collectors overlook our history while consuming iconography to see only metal and design, ignoring historical information. Selective amnesia. These bracelets don't allow for our history to be ignored, honoring the resilience of survivors and generations affected by the weight of wearing them. 3 separate sets of these have been created, and they all must be held in separate institutions. Okay, I think I'm going to make some time for some questions here. I have lots of other work, but yeah, we can probably move into some other conversations if you guys.
Fantastic. Nicholas, did you want us to start questions now?
Yes, please.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, I think that'd probably be good to get into that. So.
Wonderful. Okay, Karen, you're back on. Thank you so much for that, Nicholas.
Thank you, Nicholas. We have a question already. I will read it. This question is coming to you from Kenya, I believe. Working with community in a way that recognizes culture and engages environmental issues through a multimedia approach provide a wider vocabulary of articulation. Are there deterministic biases that add to the layers of systemic institutional complexity?
Are there, can you say that again? I'm sorry.
Yeah, no problem. It's a complex question. Are there deterministic biases that add to layers of systemic institutional complexity when you're looking at community work that engages with environmental issues and using specifically multimedia approaches, I guess? Are there deterministic biases that add to layers of systemic institutional complexity?
What do you, I don't know, what do you mean by that, though? I'm just curious. Like,
I don't know. Could we have some clarification with this question?
or an example of what you meant.
Yeah, I would be guessing.
Yeah.
Agri, did you want to amplify?
Agri, you have the ability to use your audio now. I just promoted you to panelist, so you can turn on your audio and ask if you'd like.
Okay. Thank you so much for that. I think from your conversation, you talked about as we move forward, for example, we'll be having more and more land recognitions, environmental work and including stronger institutions as are part of, the UN goals, for example, that is goal 16. What effect does this have on future decolonial work, like work that involves the community already does have a very powerful way of addressing these issues? And especially when you're using multimedia, you have music, you have sculpture in it, you have all these various ways of addressing these issues. Are there already set biases that even after dismantling the systems, are there almost determined results that maybe will add to the complexity of the problems,
I mean, there's not going to be a perfect answer to any of these things.
Yeah.
Every community's, we have, our own histories that are very different than the next community over. Like, some of our communities are cut in half by government borders, Canadian-US border splits Tlingit community. So, I mean, we're always, I feel like we're all doing work, and we know that there's work that needs to be done, but there's not a result, like, it's not a perfect way of resolving or answering or achieving things that are so complex and so woven into like generations and different perspectives and understandings of these existences. So I don't know if that answers what you're asking, but
Yes, of course, because I think the most important thing you are really working towards is addressing a very complex issue. As communities, that's what we are all trying to do. And this does transcend over many generations. So I get what you are.
and we're working in progress through what we're capable of within our times here. I feel like, anyways, some things are some of these things are taking too long and they're too slow, and they're not actually being, addressed immediately by certain communities. I feel like the land back conversation is a really good example of people's willingness to understand or to engage and recognizing Indigenous knowledge and sovereignty. And I think just the different forms of that, because some of the arguments with even land back conversation is that, well, it's it's not actual land back because it's still under colonial government, like government law and rule and regulation, right? So, but still, this is not perfect, but it's still moving towards something that oftentimes we're given tools to work with in these systems, and those tools aren't always generally inadequate for our communities. So those are challenges.
That's really an interesting way to look at it. And yeah, I think also that that's something important to think about while doing this work, really.
Thank you. Is there any other questions?
Thank you so much.
Perhaps there is another question. Yes. Thank you. The question is there an example of something your work has achieved? The question, I think, is really motivated here is engagement. Does engagement equal movement towards?
Sure. I don't think that everything's I don't know if I can quantify what, even living in a lifetime or something, what achievements have been made through this type of work, because its goal is to oftentimes create conversation and dialogue. The intentions of the work oftentimes enter institutions and spaces with that in mind. So to engage and amplify voice and perspective. Oftentimes, I feel like our community's voices have been actively ignored and silenced or erased. So to navigate audience and the world and to build or enter a platform or position creatively, there's responsibility with that. I feel like and that responsibility is to carry these things and to hopefully offer change and contribution. Sometimes change, it's very difficult to change things if you don't engage them in ways, I suppose. And so yes, I enter a lot of imperfect or problematic institutional spaces or places, and entering those spaces and operating in them oftentimes can allow for helping shift them in ways that might be more beneficial to everybody. And we are statistically excluded from a lot of spaces. Our works are statistically excluded from a lot of institutions that deem themselves fine or contemporary art. And these are ways and mechanisms of bringing these perspectives into these spaces. So it's work, and the work's intention is to do that. Its intention is to work, and I don't have to be there every day saying these things, because the work is carrying those conversations, even generationally. So.
I have a question, Nicholas. It's I'm just gonna do it audio. First of all, thank you so much for sharing your amazing work, and I'm really just blown away by just like the breadth of the material that you work with. It's truly remarkable. And I'm curious if you wouldn't mind just speaking about sort of the, your studio and how, you went to, like, you did an undergrad in fine arts at an institution where we have a certain, way that we teach or recommend people work in their studios. But then your studio is a completely different space in terms of how you mentor and collaborate and just the familial space of it. So I'm wondering if you just sort of, if you wouldn't mind speaking to that a little bit, I'd really be grateful for that.
About my actual studio space.
Yeah, and just just how you sort of like create your studio space and sort of who's in there, who you invite in there, and just
Sure.
the mentorship that you engage in.
I have a new space now that I share with my partner, Merritt Johnson, who's also an artist, and it's I've always felt like I don't decide on a medium to work with. First, generally it's concept driven, the work, so I don't know what's going to be in the space next. In my studio, I have a jewelry studio that's dedicated to metalworking. There's a larger room that has the ping pong table. It's a very important part of the process. No. And music studio upstairs in that space. So I kind of shift project to project based on what I feel like I need to be working on, I suppose, or what's going to do it. So it's always a changing space. Really. For me, the process of creativity is not based on a certain medium or a certain tool or whatever. It's based on really surrounding, really looking at ideas and seeing how they could be distilled and portrayed, in their what I would consider, their best or necessary form. So, in order to get there, though, you have to get out of your own way in that process and be willing to, do things in ways that you wouldn't assume or expect, and I think that keeps the process of creating free, and it's exciting to work that way for me. So.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
I'm going to invoke narrator's privilege if I don't see any other questions, or introducer's privilege. I find the way you're describing the creative process and the importance of getting out of your own way very poignant and very important. I wanted to ask you a question that I think relates to many of the things that you've said in response to questions. You said towards the end of your talk, when you were talking about the bentwood lockbox with the blood quantum dial, and you're thinking about the relationship also between Indigenous life and what's enshrined in ethnographic texts. And you said, and also objects in museums, you said, we belong to these objects, to the collective memory stored in them. And I wanted to ask you if you could say a little bit more or expand on what that perspective says, because that's a perspective that isn't anthropological in a sense. It's not human-centered.
It recognizes the deeper connection to place that we have and hold. That's in our DNA. It's memory in our DNA. It's a spiritual or ceremonial connection to objects, to care for them, that culturally is understood that they engage our communities in ways that are important and come through, you know, sometimes only through ceremony or through healing or through different forms of accessing things like supernatural or spiritual worlds, or through healing, through different aspects of our existence. And there's nothing about that aspect that has ever been maintained in institutional spaces or settings where they've often been removed and poisoned with arsenic, and of course defaced with like catalog numbers, etc. And then stored away in places like dark old basements, etc. So those are real spaces that we still have to navigate today. When I want to access my community's cultural language and inheritance or objects, I have to travel the world and access it through institution, through curators and institution, and then go and spend and experience them in those spaces far removed from culture, far removed from the use of it in our communities. And those are things that I became aware of early on as I was just studying my cultural art and learning about those connections through doing. So.
Thank you. That stands in such sharp contrast to the way you began your talk in this embedded space on land with your children, working with them, working with family members, working with community members. This way you were also talking about how objects, the act of engaging with objects is itself also part of teaching and learning and cultural transmission. So I see those two pictures juxtaposed in a really profound way and critical way in your work. Thank you. Are there other questions?
I think Karen, we're hitting 8:15, so we could probably wrap up if you're okay with that.
Yeah, I would just say thank you for showing us this picture, Nicholas, also of the canoe right side up. So we see that transformation. That's really amazing.
Well, Karen, there's one more question here. Sorry, maybe we can conclude with Lisa's question, if that's okay. Is that okay, Nicholas? Are you okay for one more?
Sure.
Okay, thank you so much.
This question asks, did you face any resistance to your mission, whether from within your community or from outside entities? And if so, how do you deal with that, especially working on the statue?
Which mission?
I think the questioner means the Captain Cook statue, but I would take clarification on that.
Oh, did I face any resistance? No, that work actually, the only resistance from that piece came from the city of Sydney. The original proposal was to actually excavate the shadow of the statue itself, and they wouldn't allow for that. which worked out, I think, anyways, because the work happens in a different space, and I think it was stronger to have that work without the statue there on site. But as far as I think that conversation in that piece, I didn't experience really much that type of resistance, I suppose, from that work. So. But I, I was, what I enjoyed about that piece too was that it was really a gestural work in a sense, or where it was doing something that was, envisioning and sharing a future free from some of these things. And I think that translated to most viewers in a way that seemed to be well received. So. Of course, there was always those people that support that narrative of that statue, and I'm sure they have all kinds of issues with this type of conversation. Any other questions?
I'm wondering if you would play through the sequence of cut images for the way the log directs what happens.
So this was a stop motion of the last canoe carved here. So it's about 10 months of one image per day. That was that. I think we're about this canoe I'm working on now. I would say we're about right. Let's see. Here. We're about right here in this stage. Right there. Almost there. So we've got these are dowels that you put in the bottom. You measure how deep the hole is to the thickness you want the canoe to be. So about an inch to an inch and a half. We sink these in, and you put a little bit of like blue chalk on the end of the dowel inside. And then when we flip it and carve, we'll uncover and hit that dowel from the inside, and that lets us know that we're, at thickness we need the canoe to be before steaming it. So,
That's really beautiful, and really an extraordinary relationship between making and knowledge and the tree, what the tree holds to or what the tree teaches to.
yeah.
That's really wonderful. Thank you. I'm not seeing more questions.
Right. Let's see this. I'll do one more video for you. So this is a 3D scan of the canoe before the steam and after the steam. You'll see an orange and a green color, and those are the transformations that happen after we steam it. So this is after steaming, final shape. This is pre-steam. You'll see the, oops, let's go back. Hold on. Pre-steam, you see how thin those gunnels are in the beam, the edges, the sides there. That's, and then if you look at the bottom, it has a little concave on it. Orange is after steaming, so it gets wider. These are cross sections. You can see how much it transforms. So in the center, this area down here is, you know, the width of it. These spread out. In this case, I think this opened up 14 inches. Keep going back. Sorry. So it's, you know, it's a significant transformation, and the bottom drops down a bit. So. Great. Wow.
That is really cool. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Oh, somebody has a question. Will the recording of this talk be available and when? I think there will be an answer to that.
Yep, I'm just actually typing it in the chat right now with the with I think what is the website, our website, and we do have it on the exact same site where you found the link for the talk. You will find a recording of this and other talks. So I just put it in the answer. But yeah, thank you for that question. Yes, everything will be available. And yeah, thank you so much, Nicholas, for your time with us. It was just so brilliant, so inspiring.
Thank you for having me. Thank you for everything.
Great, and hopefully we'll see you in person here one day or anywhere else where you have your wonderful exhibitions. But you have a wonderful. Thank you again, and thanks everyone for joining us today. Really appreciate it. Very grateful.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. Real pleasure.
Okay, everyone, I'm going to just stop it.